In a quiet, upscale restaurant in Dallas, the kind where politicians and oil tycoons whisper deals over $1,000 bottles of wine, Jacqueline Kennedy stepped through the door wearing a simple navy coat and the faint smile of a woman who had already buried too much. It was November 1964, exactly 1 year after the shots in Dealey Plaza, and the former First Lady had agreed to a rare, private dinner with old friends who insisted she needed to get out. She kept her head low, her trademark sunglasses still on even indoors, hoping the evening could pass in peace. It didn't. The new general manager, a sharply dressed 30-something who wore his progressive politics the way others wear cologne, recognized her immediately. His face hardened. Word around the staff was that he'd been loudly vocal ever since the election, calling anyone who had ever supported her late husband on the wrong side of history. When Jacqueline reached the hostess stand, he stepped forward himself. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Kennedy," he said, voice dripping with rehearsed politeness. "We're fully booked tonight." For the entire evening, the restaurant was half empty. The light hung in the air like smoke. Her Secret Service agent took one step forward, but Jacqueline gently touched his arm. She understood humiliation she had felt it the day the world watched her husband die in her lap. She simply nodded, turned, and walked back into the Texas night without a word. The handful of patrons who witnessed it sat frozen. One elderly woman began to cry. The next morning, the city woke up to a sight no one would ever forget. At exactly 8 a.m., a 1962 Rolls-Royce Phantom V, midnight blue with the presidential seal still faintly visible beneath years of careful repainting, rolled slowly down the street and stopped directly in front of the restaurant. The same car that had carried John F. Kennedy through Dallas on that terrible day. The same car that had carried his flag-draped coffin afterward. It gleamed under the winter sun like a ghost that refused to stay buried. The driver, a white-gloved man in his 70s who had served the Kennedy family for 3 decades, stepped out and opened the rear door. Out came Robert F. Kennedy, still Attorney General, still wearing the exhaustion of a man fighting battles on every front. He walked straight through the front doors that had been locked against his sister-in-law only hours before. Inside, the staff stood paralyzed. The manager, summoned from his office, appeared in the dining room with the smug confidence of someone who believed history would thank him one day. Bobby Kennedy did not raise his voice. He never had to. "My sister-in-law was refused service here last night," he began, his Boston accent soft but edged with steel. "A woman who has given more to this country than you will ever comprehend. A woman who held her dying husband in her arms while the world watched. You turned her away because of politics." The manager opened his mouth to protest, but Bobby raised one hand. "I'm not here to argue with you," he continued. "I'm here to remind you of something Jack always believed. In America, we don't turn people away because we disagree with them. We don't punish widows for the votes their husbands inspired. We don't spit on grief to prove we're enlightened." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a check written on a personal account enough to purchase the entire building outright. He placed it on the hostess stand. "This restaurant now belongs to the Kennedy family. You have 2 choices. You can resign today with a generous severance and your reputation intact, or you can stay and work for people who still believe manners matter more than ideology. Your call." The manager's face strained of color. The elderly waiter who had served the Kennedys since Hyannisport days wiped tears from his eyes. A young busboy who had only started the week before whispered, "God bless you, sir," loud enough for everyone to hear. Bobby turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing," he said, almost as an afterthought. "From now on, every veteran, every police officer, every firefighter, every single mother trying to feed her kids, anyone who walks through these doors eats for free on the anniversary of my brother's death. That's not politics. That's decency." He climbed back into the Rolls-Royce. The car pulled away as silently as it had arrived, leaving the restaurant staff standing in a silence heavier than any shouting could ever be. By noon, the manager's resignation was on the new owner's desk. By evening, the story was all over Dallas, then all over the country. Old women who had never voted Democrat in their lives called radio stations in tears. Veterans stood a little straighter. And somewhere in Virginia, Jacqueline Kennedy read the telegram Bobby sent her. "He would have been proud of you for walking away with Grace last night, and he would have been proud of us for not letting them forget who we are this morning. All my love, Bobby." Years later, long after the restaurant had become a quiet landmark where strangers still left flowers on November 22, people would argue about whether the story had been embellished. But the old-timers who were there that day, the waiters who watched the family refuse to let grief be weaponized, the busboy who grew up to become a marinier, they all told the same version. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it rolls up in a midnight blue Rolls-Royce, speaks barely above a whisper, and reminds the world that dignity, once lost, can still be reclaimed, and that no O'Neill gets to kick a widow while she's still learning how to live without the love of her life. Not in Texas, not in America, not ever.